tonight we have, this is our last meeting for the 2020-2021 session.
Yes.
I think that's the 147th session of the Society. And so it's my last opportunity for chairing and showing off my presidential medal that you've all laughed at. So I'm very pleased to have two speakers tonight who are both graduates of Bristol University Medical School, and we're going to hear from them about their experiences. Liz threatened that she would use her husband's experiences of medical school rather than her own because they seem to be much more interesting, but when pressed she declined. So it's going to be just hers only. Liz Cutt, I'd like to invite you to start. So if you come on, and if you share your screen, we will disappear. I'll come back in when you're finished and Jane's about to start to make sure you guys are still awake and going ahead. And I'm going to...
Yeah, so can you all hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. And as it's the last meeting of the season, it's just as well that it's light-hearted. So that's how I hope to keep it for you all. So I came to Bristol University and was at medical school in the latter half of the 1970s, so from 1975 to 1980. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm basically going to cover the subjects that you see ahead of you, which is, I hope, what David has asked us to do. And so, yeah, thank you very much for asking me. So I was born in Shanghai. I have a Chinese mother and a German father, so I am a German national. And I was living in Shanghai until I was 6 years old. My father was unfortunately a prisoner of Mao Zedong purely for being a German. And when we were dispatched out of China, we ended up in Hong Kong. So that's where I spent my younger years and where I went to school. When we arrived in Hong Kong, there were no foreign language schools, so no German school for me to go to, but obviously being a British colony, we had English schools, foundation schools. So I went to the local junior school. We went to the German school on a Saturday. And then for my senior years, I went to the island school, which was established in 1967, which was the year that I entered year 7. I did my A-levels, you know, the same boards that everybody does here in the UK, because we followed the English curriculum entirely. I found physics, maths, and chemistry relatively simple. And although there were no medics in my family, this was, you know, a career that I had mapped out for myself from about the age of 12. So when it came to choosing medical schools, I first of all had to choose which country I would go to. I had a sister who was already at studying chemistry in Munich, so she had gone to Germany. And when we looked into medical schools in Germany, it turned out they wanted Latin. The island school didn't do Latin. And for me, it was just as well, because my understanding was that the German medical school system was very heavily academic based. And I really wanted to go to a medical school where we would have the opportunity to have a lot of clinical interaction, because I was far more interested in that side of things. And of course, I then went through the UCA application process that everybody else did. Now, having never stepped foot in the UK and not knowing anything about the UK medical schools, I had probably a rather frivolous reason for choosing the ones that I did choose. So Oxford and Cambridge for me meant that I would have to stay at school for another term in order to sit Oxbridge, which was, I believe, in the following autumn term. As far as I could see from the map, Edinburgh was a very long way north and was going to be far too cold for my subtropical blood. London to me you know, from afar anyway, looked like another big city, which I really wasn't interested in living in. Manchester, my father told me, had a lot of good cotton mills and so on, because that was his business. But I don't know that it had any other appeal for me. And Bristol, I was told by the school that it had an excellent reputation. It was extremely difficult to get to, but was a smaller city. And to my mind, appeared to be close to the coast. So if you're looking at this map, you know, sitting in Hong Kong, you think, oh, well, that's not bad. I lived, you know, I spent most of my youth either in the water or on the water. So being close to water was very appealing. But of course, nobody told me about the Severn Estuary, the massive tides, and the mud in Weston. An awful lot of my youth was spent behind a boat on a plank of wood. And so when I was also told that there was a water festival in Bristol Docks where they had the water ballet, I thought, well, that's great, because that's what I did in Hong Kong in 1974, standing there on the far right. So, you know, for that reason, as much as anything else, I duly applied to Bristol. Now, I don't know what it was that meant that I didn't get any offers in my first year, in my first attempt, but it meant that I had to have an enforced gap year. I did have the grades that Bristol were reported to be asking for. So I moved to the UK, and luckily I had a very good school friend who came to Brighton to do fine art. And so I came with her, we lived in a bedsit, and I managed to get a job as a nursing auxiliary at Bevendine Hospital in Brighton, which I thought would also look good on my CV. This was what they called a psychogeriatric hospital, and was a really wonderful formative year for me, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I also think it was I also thought, well, if I was lucky enough to be invited for an interview, I would at least be here. Luckily, I was. So I duly pitched up and saw that I had to go for an interview at Senate House. I booked myself into the Hawthorns Hotel, which was right opposite, so I didn't have to, get lost on my way, and crammed, as much clinical knowledge as I possibly could before I arrived. Anyway, turns out I didn't really need it, because apart from being asked, well, why do you want to come to medical school? Seems to me that the only thing they were interested was, well, you come from Hong Kong, you're not British, can you speak English? And the second question was, and will your father pay the fees? And when I said yes to both of those things, they said, well, it's fine, we'll see you in October then. So in October, I rolled up, and my first year was in Baydock Hall. So that was the other side of the Downs. I do remember that the food was terrible, but at least I didn't have to cook it. And of course, for all of us, it was that long walk to the medical school across the Downs. And when we had 9 to 5 lectures every day, it meant we had much longer days than the other students who appeared to be living in that same hall of residence. And it was also a time when there were the rumours and certainly some attacks on the Downs. So we as women would only ever go across the Downs in pairs. But I did make good friends. What nobody told me was that we'd have to move out of the hall for the Christmas holidays because they used the facilities for conferences. And, since I had no plans to go back to Hong Kong, and it was really rather expensive for me, I was potentially homeless over Christmas, but luckily I was scooped up by one of the girls in my year and spent a wonderful Christmas in London with her and her family. When we came back to Baydock after the Christmas holidays, we found, to our dismay, all our possessions in black plastic bags, because during the Christmas holidays, there'd been an enormous storm. The roof of Baydock Hall, our block at least, had lifted off, flown over the wall and landed in the grounds of Hyatt Baker. So since Jane and I were on the top, not Jane Sampson, my friend Jane, were on the top floor, we couldn't stay there, and we spent a few nights at the Clifton Hotel whilst other suitable accommodation in the Bay Dock grounds was found for us. So that was my first Christmas. The preclinical years, as I remember, were not much fun. There were full days of lectures, and we had our lectures, I remember, either in the medical school or in E49, I believe, the lecture hall on St. Michael's Hill. School had been relatively easy for me, but medical school was a completely different, kettle of fish. There was new vocabulary, and I could see entirely why Latin might have been a really good subject to take. I'm sure, like many others, the formalin smell in those weekly anatomy dissections sessions was quite overwhelming. And of course, you had to attend because there were also the weekly spot tests when there were random pins in small nerves and blood vessels that we had to identify. So it wasn't easy, and they made it worse for us by making sure we had exams immediately after the Christmas holidays. And that was the first exam I think I ever failed. And I was so fed up that I had to come back to resit that I vowed never to do another resit. And so I guess those first 2 years felt like school, but worse. And I know Jane will probably tell you something very different, but I don't really remember having too much fun. So of course I didn't choose to intercalate, but went straight into my clinical years. Of course, the medical and surgical firms were probably the most memorable because we spent the most time in those firms with the pairs of consultants at the head, and then the senior staff, the registrars and so on below them. I remembered far less about the shorter specialty attachments. And although I had a real wish in those early stages to do pediatrics, I honestly don't remember that much about the pediatric attachments that we had at the time, because we had the 2 small wards at Southmead and then obviously the Children's Hospital. The lectures, I remember, could occasionally be rather racy because, if you're showing a rash, why not show it on somebody who has a rather fetching anatomy? But apparently I am told that despite those attempts to make them more interesting, I used to take my knitting in. Now, I have no recollection of that, but my flatmate tells me she remembers clearly me turning up at lectures with my knitting. In terms of the clinical attachments, I was based mostly at the BRI French A at Southmead, and so really didn't need to spend much time outside the city. But I do remember that no one wanted to be at the BRI because it was felt to be perhaps more unfriendly, perhaps more scary. And certainly I remember senior nurses being very scary. And as a medical student, you did well if you made friends with them. Of course, we remember very well the senior consultants of the time. Professor Alan Reed, who wrote his famous medical school textbook, was extremely scary. Ken Heaton was the fiber man. Bob Coles was everybody's father and grandfather. Gabriel Laszlo was very, very academic, and Malcolm Campbell, the world's greatest problem solver, I think. In terms of the surgeons, well, those were the firms that I remember. And so I spent time with Webb and Barnes and Webb, and then some time on the firm with Colin Davidson out at French A. But most of them were memorable to me because I was absolutely terrified of them. And I must admit, I always remember the negative encounters. I remember a ward round when we as the medical students would of course have to present our patients. And we were always very nervous. So when I was presenting to Ken Heaton and described a man with chest pain and that we felt his diagnosis was a heart attack, he said to me, "My dear, we don't call it a heart attack. We call it a myocardial infarction." Well, you can bet I never called chest pain anything other than a possible myocardial infarction from that day onwards. And my other encounter with John Webb, whom I love dearly and with whom I worked for many, many happy years as a consultant in Bristol, he was even more of a taskmaster and he was a great historian. So I was presenting a patient and I had noticed that this patient who came in to have his hernia done had a wooden leg. And so I remembered to ask him the circumstances surrounding the loss of this limb. And I even asked him, you know, which battle it was, so that when I was asked to present this patient, I was very proud of myself and thought, well, you know, certainly nothing he's going to, you know, I haven't missed anything, I'm sure. And so when I'd been through it all, John immediately said, well, what battalion was he in? Well, of course, I mean, I didn't know one battalion from another, so I couldn't ever get it quite right. Of course, our staff were memorable for other reasons. Ken Heaton for the Bristol stool chart, Professor Reed, of course, for his medical textbook and the Celestin tube. And I'm sure there are many other things for which our eminent medical staff were famous for, which I've failed to remember. But my favorite attachment was probably with a GP in Brixham, because I lived with that GP and his family for a couple of weeks. And there was lots of opportunity for one-to-one learning, which was something that I probably missed because it was always group teaching. And we never really, or at least I didn't think I ever really got to know anybody terribly well, the consultants anyway. In terms of my peers, we were probably 110 students. We had a high proportion of women, so probably 50-50. There are about 10 of us from overseas, so a fair few of them, and I probably identify more with any of them than any of my British friends, although, you know, I do have a wonderful group of British friends now. And then there were the mature students, and they stood out because they worked so hard, they knew everything, and they put us all to shame. But I did make a wonderful group of friends. I pretty much organized the reunions that we've had every 10 years, and that's always been a great success. But of course, we weren't able to do anything for 2020, which would have been our 40th anniversary. The research participation wasn't anything that I instigated, but medical students were certainly considered to be good guinea pigs. So I do remember taking part in an experiment which was to do with drinking alcohol, and you didn't know whether you were drinking orange juice or orange juice laced with vodka, and then you had to do a whole series of tests. And then there were some of us who were also asked to take a medication, and I think it was lorazepam or a placebo, and do memory tests. And I suspect that we were drawn to this because maybe there was a cash incentive. I couldn't possibly say. In terms of the non-academic activity, I wasn't really a huge society, you know, I didn't join Galenicals or any of the sporting clubs because I didn't really play team sport. I spent my youth swimming or water skiing. So I briefly joined the scuba diving club, but then when I found we actually had to do a dive on some tank in Plymouth, I thought, well, actually, maybe that's not for me. I did try water skiing, and yes, I did water ski in Bristol Docks, and yes, I did water ski at Western, but I only did it once in each. And of course, I think most of us joined the Dance Society Ciroc for some time. I think our most fun were in some of the year-end productions that we had at the medical school, and most memorably, the X-rated sketches that we did at the end of the 4th year. with some rather interesting cocktails that we also had on offer and imbibed. The final year was both good and bad. It was good because we'd already done our exams, and so we only had the clinical vivas to do at the end of the 5th year. We had to do a stint of epidemiology, which was based at Canning Hall. And I took the opportunity to go home to Hong Kong because I thought, well, I probably won't be spending much time here once I qualify. I had no interest in practicing medicine in Hong Kong because I had no interest in practicing private health. I think what drew me to the UK more than anything was the thought of working within the NHS. But I did have fun doing pediatrics in Hong Kong, albeit the time almost as soon as I arrived in Hong Kong that October, my father was diagnosed with metastatic cancer, which I'm sure was lung cancer, as he was a heavy cigarette smoker. But I had to come back to the UK in February to finish my studies. My father died in April, and I wasn't able to be at his funeral, but I will forever be grateful for my mother, who made it to my graduation in June. So that was a very poignant time for us both, because I've always felt terrible that my father wasn't able to be there. So overall, for lots of reasons, I think perhaps because I was an overseas student, perhaps because, it was all very alien to me and the circumstances surrounding my father's death, I didn't particularly enjoy medical school. I hope Jane will tell you something different. I found the second MB a lot of work. I didn't like feeling a spare part on the wards. I think I need to feel needed. And there did seem to be an awful lot of hanging around waiting for senior staff who sometimes didn't turn up to teach us. I didn't particularly like the way the house jobs were allocated. And even though I can't even remember how they were allocated, I do remember booking an appointment to talk to Malcolm Campbell about it. And anyway, he can't have been too upset with me because he offered me one of his house jobs. And I just couldn't wait to put on that long white coat. There were, of course, highlights. I loved the patient interaction. I enjoyed practical procedures. I enjoyed the problem solving. And we did have good interaction with some of the younger consultants, perhaps because they were that much closer to our age. And I don't know why, but I do remember very much that as the medical firm, we were invited to Malcolm Campbell's house because we were on his firm. And being medical students, we didn't know that if we were invited, we should turn up at 8 o'clock, because everywhere you went, you always turned up at 9 or later, because make sure everybody had eaten already. But we went there and found that he had all his other guests waiting for us because they had this wonderful home cooked meal. And they were very gracious about it and didn't make us feel awkward at all. I was totally inspired by Peter Wilde in radiology, I have to admit. And although pediatrics was what I had originally intended to pursue, I obviously then pursued a career in radiology and very much enjoyed. So just a few snaps of us in our theatre scrubs and our best 1970s gear. The graduation picture, although I couldn't find a photo of my own graduation for some reason. But I did just want to mention the mentoring, because I think that although I have what I would call mental health issues or anything like that, I really feel that the new students need mentors. And I'm really pleased to know that nowadays they do have both peer mentors and more senior staff looking after them, because certainly for me, it was very disorientating to move to a new country, a new city and away. And when I was a personal tutor, I made sure that I was personal tutor to students from overseas. And, I loved getting to know people from Sri Lanka, from Malaysia, from Trinidad, and many of them are still in touch with me. And I then joined the rather more structured academic mentor program, but I think the students really appreciated that regular contact, which was something I think I lacked. So I know that I maybe have sounded a less than completely happy note about my time at Bristol, but absolutely no regrets, because after all, that's the city I have chosen to stay in, and I have loved being here. So thank you. And I'll just stop sharing now.
Yes, thanks, Liz. So I enjoy that. I enjoyed some of your comments, and I did actually enjoy your frankness about what your experience, that it wasn't all wonderful, and I think that's quite appropriate to say. And you know, and I guess the proof of the pudding is that you did stay on as a consultant here in Bristol, so that's quite reassuring. Thank you very much. We'll defer questions to the end, so I'm going to call out to Clifton now and ask for Jane Sampson to turn herself inside out, or at least back on screen. Here she comes, right.
Hi, David.
So, Liz, if you want to turn your camera off, and Jane, if you would like to take over, I will stop my video and mute myself. So I can hear you fine, so I'm sure you're okay.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, so thanks, Liz, for that, and certainly some of that resonated with me. So David asked us to do this talk such a long time ago. You know, when something's a long way away, you think, oh yeah, that'll be fine. And as ever, there's always other things that get in the way. So about 3 or 4 weeks ago, obviously, I went into full panic mode because I hadn't really done any preparation. I asked all my friends. I raided the archive of black bags in Dolphin House, and and at the weekend, or just before the weekend, I managed to find my old lecture notes in the cellar, together with a few other bits and pieces. So that gave me an array of things to look at, and you will see here they are on our sitting room floor, and you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there was quite an archive of material. But I've got lots of snippets to show you, so mine is mostly pictorial. So a bit like Liz, so nothing like Liz in terms of background, but I'll let you know where I've come from. So I was born in Queen Camel, which is a small village down here in Somerset. And I'm just going to minimize myself, that's better. So you can see it's a little tiny village down here, and I was literally born at home. My mum had a quite significant postpartum hemorrhhage, such that they told my dad that she might not make it. Luckily, she did. So I grew up in this strangely named village called Queen Camel, which had about 400 residents at the time. So everybody knew everybody, and everybody went to the local school. This is the local school, now turned into a sort of local community hub, but this was the school that my dad had been to, and this was the primary school that I went to, which is the Countess Geetha Primary School. So Countess Geetha was, I think, the wife of an Anglo-Saxon king, and Queen Camel was called Queen Camel because the land belonged to the wife of Henry III. So it's always had ideas above its station, Queen Camel, I think. But the primary school was amazing. There were a husband and wife team who were the head teacher and the teacher of the top class, and they absolutely had high expectations of all students. I had the benefit, because they thought I was clever, of spending 3 years in the top 4. And the main bonus of that was I got to see the sex education film 3 times. So I was quite an expert by the time I went to secondary school. I had a quick look at the black bag of what was going on in the University of Bristol in the 1960s. And so this is a black bag, which is, as many of you will know, is the journal of the medical school faculty. And it was quite a, it was quite a tome, I think, in those days. So this is the autumn edition, 1961. And here we are. Why is Bristol today's cigarettes? So an interesting juxtaposition of tobacco advertising. And then here is a little profile of some of the Glenical's officers in the, I think this is 1961 or 62. And I looked at these and I thought, gosh, they look very serious and old when they're meant to be students. But I guess, that was the era. And interestingly, I checked out Tony Dickens, and I think if it's the same Tony Dickens, he in fact gave a Med Chi talk in 2003 about RMS Carmania. I couldn't find Terry Wood, but Tony Giddings went on, who was obviously quite an eminent fellow, went on to become a general and vascular surgeon and was involved in the Bristol Heart Inquiry. So, you know, it is interesting how people have gone on to do different things. And in this edition of the 1961 edition, congratulations to Dr. Bob Coles and Dr. Barrett on their appointment as consultant physicians to the BRI. So they had been in Bristol a long time by the time I got there. Liz has talked quite a lot about getting into medical school. I was just pleased to get through school, so I went to secondary school in Yeovil. That was called Yeovil High School for Girls, which became Westfield Comprehensive, and perhaps unusually, well, we did Latin, so that was a bonus, I have to say, coming to medical school, and actually quite useful in dermatology. And then I went to sixth form college in Yeovil, which was an hour's, so Yeovil was an hour's bus journey, which meant you could get to do your homework on the bus, is what I found on a fairly regular basis. Applying to medical school. So these are, again, a couple of things I managed to find when I was going through the archives. A slightly later prospectus of medicine at Bristol, but I think anybody that's been in the medical school will remember the library where we spent many hours sort of poring over books or sometimes having a bit of a snooze. I came across this alternative prospectus and I thought, well, quite a lot of that certainly rang true for me. There are normally more than 3,000 applicants for 135 places. There is no longer any discrimination against female applicants, thankfully. This is where the medical school was, of course, in those days, on University Walk, when it was called the medical school. A common room, a rather too small canteen, I'd agree with all that. The football machine, all of those things were definitely available, but the cool people usually got to use them first. And the criticism of the preclinical course, divorced from hospital-based clinical work taught mainly by non-clinicians, most students forget their intellectual dream and just learn enough to pass their exams. That was always my intention. And a bit like Liz, I think I found preclinical quite hard. And I, like Liz, also failed an exam, and it was the first exam I'd ever failed. And like her, I found it a rather humiliating experience, which I didn't want to repeat. When I came to Bristol, there'd been there were too many applicants for the number of places in halls of residence. So actually, I started off my student existence for the first few weeks living in St Helena Road in Westbury Park, which was the home of, at the time, Dr. David Clark, who at the time was lecturer in law, who of course went on to become a very eminent member of the university as Deputy Vice-Chancellor. After a few weeks, a space became available in Manor Hall in Clifton, which only accepted women students. And I shared a room with another girl who had previously been to a convent school, and that didn't work out too well. In that she was making the most of not being in a convent anymore, and I found that quite a difficult experience. And eventually we were split. We were allowed to have different rooms. But it was quite an interesting experience. The porters used to come round at 10 o'clock every night to check that you didn't have young men in your room, which was sometimes the case. Becoming a student, so I think I missed out a little bit on those, that camaraderie of the first few weeks because we weren't in halls. So I never became, and I probably wouldn't have been anyway, part of the cool gang. Faffy Squash was what the Freshers' Week was called, sometimes called Find a Friendly First Year, where lots of university societies tried to take money away from you. In a small village in Somerset, there aren't very many things you can do, but learning to bell ring was one of those. And Queen Camel had the very impressive sounding accolade of having the heaviest peal of 6 bells in the world at the time. It's now the second heaviest. So I had a little bit of kudos with the University of Society of Change Ringers. And although it sounds like a bit of a nerdy activity, and it is at times, it is also great fun, and it's given me lifelong friends in all sorts of different arenas. So I spent a lot of my first 2 to 3 years when I wasn't doing my medical student studies, honing my bell ringing skills, and Bristol remains a great centre of excellence for bell ringing. Our home tower was St Michael on the Mount Without, which of course is on St Michael's Hill. And this was the 75th anniversary dinner of the Society of Change Ringers, held in the, of course, the Great Hall. So this was our year in 1979. So this is the motley crew standing outside of the medical school, and you can see we are all shapes and sizes. I'm not actually looking towards the camera at that point, and my hair looks rather out of control, as it probably was for most of my student life. But this was the gang with whom I spent most of the next 5 years. So preclinical medicine, as Liz has already alluded to, I can't remember that much other than it was hard. And we had spot tests and demonstrators, and Jonathan Musgrave kind of, ruled the roost a little bit in the dissecting room. I've still got my medical textbooks shown here. I think I kept them just because I was always slightly worried that I might need to go and check something again. That uncertainty and imposter syndrome stays with you for life in my case. The textbook of histology, a beautiful book. I can see it's not been opened that much, which I think I thought by buying it, that meant I would probably just by osmosis, some of the facts would sink in. I don't think that was quite right. We do, of course, remember, so David Speller was a great friend to medical students, I think, and a very benign and lovely man. And, there's a nice interview in one of the Black Bag magazines from David Speller. In between our lectures, a favourite haunt was the Rose Again, a cafe on St Michael's Hill. And I'm sure that we all kept them going with when we could afford to go and buy an expensive coffee. Preclinical medicine, bit of a challenge, really. Lots of microbiology, which, as you can see here, was relabeled in my archive as medical microboredom. We remembered all of my friends remembered the physiology lecture, which involved drinking beer. And like Liz, I remember the vodka experiment looking at our reaction times. And that's about as much as I remember of a lot of the preclinical medicine. Of course, we sometimes had to do library projects, and we all had to use Index Medicus. This was days before Google and PubMed. It was a different era, wasn't it? And I'm sure many of you will remember all of that. I wasn't particularly cool, so I didn't get involved in Rag Week, which a lot of my friends did. But I did get involved in things like OPSOC and some of the reviews. This is a preclinical review from, I think, 1980 or 81. So these are exam papers. Again, I think Liz has already set the scene for some of these. And I must admit, when I found them, I thought, well, I wonder how this would go down with today's students and how this really relates to being a doctor. I guess some of this is useful, but I would possibly struggle with Cro-Magnon man. But I'm very happy to be put right on that. Physiology, again, some very detailed scientific knowledge required. And then behavioural science, well, you can see there some of those questions look quite interesting, and you can see which ones I chose to answer. Write an essay on the relationship between illness and social class. Examine the social processes involved in the creation of stigma. So some very interesting things to get through second MB, and then if we made it, hooray, we were into clinical medicine, and that was what we were all really keen to get involved in. So this is the clinical program, 1981, first clinical year appointments. These were the different firms available, so surgical firms and medical firms at the BRI, ENT, and then where you had to report, because of course in those days students didn't go further afield than Western for their clinical attachments, and only a few got to go to Western, although we all loved going to Southmead and Frenchay. We even had our own note paper for medical students, and I remember that feeling, that sense of pride that you're allowed to actually record some of your history taking and findings. So my first surgical firm, which I do remember quite well, I remember bits of it, I think, quite vividly. As Liz has already said, you know, there were the standard texts that we used. So Professor Reed's Modern Medicine, this was the Bible that we all used in our clinical years. The good thing about the lecture notes was, although they were quite bulky books, you could put them in your short white coat pocket. It stretched them a little bit, but it was a useful thing to carry around. So I started off, here's me, doing the Williamson, Peacock and Leaper firm. And I think there was already some, you know, some subliminal stereotyping coming at us from the surgeons that taught us, because I've got this written in my notes. In a surgeon's gown, physicians may make much progress. So an extensive range of tutorials, all of which were quite interesting. So surgical firm, what did we do? Well, we learned how to take blood, we made each other faint, we tried to clerk patients, we went on ward rounds like Liz. I can remember being utterly terrified of the consultants that taught us. We went to theatre, we hung on to retractors for hours on end. There were some characters of whom we were completely terrified, Mike Horrocks being one of them, who of course went on to be a professor in Bath. The perhaps easier to get to know and a very smooth Neil Mortensen, who of course is the current president of the Royal College of Surgeons. I do like this sketch in the one of the black bags. So here we are getting through school, arrive as a cool dude at university. This is the bit I definitely identify with. Here we are, the lowest ranking person in the hospital, the third-year medical student in your short white coat, bullied by everyone. And it did feel a little bit like that, but we did stick together and look after each other. You gradually get through, you graduate, and then of course you become a houseman, and you're still the lowest of the low again. But you know, we all got there in the end. Dolphin House, of course, notorious for firm parties, for beer. Dolphin House Bar was what kept us all going in times of fun and laughter. And it was a great resource for students. But yeah, you know, so you could order your beer for firm parties. And I must say, we did have a cracking end of firm party. And I didn't even know I had these photographs. Here we have Robin Williamson. Here we have David Leaper, and I'm sure you will all recognise the genius at the piano that is Paul Goddard. Then I went on to do medical firm with the inspirational Malcolm Campbell and the lovely Dr. Barrett, who I remember used to just be so nice to his patients. He used to sort of sit down and lie down next to them and put his arm around them. And we all thought he was rather wonderful because he was so caring. And again, Liz has already mentioned the characters that we remember. Gabriel Laszlo, we remember the lovely, kind people. Ralph Barry, of course, who went on to do a lot with us as students in later life. This is one of my clerking. So this took me back to the fact that we probably did do some sort of long case, although I don't think it was ever observed. I think we were just sent off to clerk a patient. And I've obviously had some comments here, and it can't have been that bad. I got a good. So things were looking up once I hit clinical medicine. I had to include the specials, of course, being a dermatologist, and I managed to find the notes, and I managed to find the lecture timetable for dermatology. And of course, these wonderful people then have become my supervising consultants in later life. So the amazing John Burton, a true polymath, a man of great intellectual ability, always questioning and querying and having great ideas. And he wrote not just, of course, major textbooks in dermatology, but he produced other little natty things like the Aids to Undergraduate Medicine. Cameron, of course, who is still working with us in dermatology, doing clinics from time to time, an inspirational clinician, without a doubt. And these were the specials: ENT, ophthalmology, dermatology, and those possibly unnatural bedfellows, oncology and VD. We did supplement student grants at least I did, because I was pretty short of money. by doing drug trials, and we did them with Clive Roberts right up on the top of the old building at the BRI. And I can remember doing a diclofenac study, and we had to have blood taken at all hours. And I think it was for a sum of about £100, which was a huge amount of money as a student. But I shared my flat at that in my third year with a medic and some non-medics, and I had to get the non-medics to take the blood, which is quite an achievement really. So I used to stick the needle in my vein and they would pull back on the syringe. And I can remember one of them squealing, "Oh my goodness, it's so warm," which they hadn't expected. The boys, and I remember there were quite regular adverts in the university newsletter for sperm donors, and some of my friends do recall that that was another source of income for our male colleagues. A few icons from Dolphin House, which again, a great place for students. Students bar in Dolphin House, now open, and you could get it, so weekdays it was open 12 till 2. You could get a ploughman's lunch for 20p, and you could presumably get beer at lunchtime, and you could get it for private hire, and we definitely had some good parties in Dolphin House. This is Dolphin House today. So the bar style seating is still retained. It's been a bit refurbished, and it is going to go at some stage. I don't know if Liz remembers this. This was Bob Coles. So Bob Coles used to sit in the corridor on the second floor of Dolphin House. And if you had to go and see him, you waited outside in the corridor until the buzzer system told you whether you were allowed to come in, whether you had to wait or whether he was engaged. George's, of course, was where we got all of our textbooks, halfway down Park Street. And then there were a few other little icons. So the waffle shop was a great place to go and stock up if you were feeling wealthy. After you'd been on a night out and about 11:30, you'd pop in and get a cheesecake, was usually the preferred thing to eat at the end of a long evening. Year 4 is when we did all of these different specialties. So 8 weeks of each. And of course, our curriculum, as we now look back on it, was pretty heavily weighted towards obstetrics and gynecology. So there was 8 weeks of obstetrics, there's 4 weeks gynae, 4 weeks neonatology. And this, we did our child health, of course, in the old children's hospital. I obviously managed to persuade my parents I needed a car at this stage. I think in fact, I did go to do anaesthetics in Bath, so I needed to travel around a bit. And my dad, always treating me exactly the same as my brothers, said, well, if you're going to borrow the car, you need to know how to change the tyre. So this is my dad, obviously laughing his head off, supervising me, trying to learn how to change a tyre. I don't know why I'm wearing such a prissy outfit. It's definitely my Sunday best, but that was the condition for me to borrow my mum's car, I think. So year 4 started with, so these are some documents I found. I'll show you one in a bit more detail. These are the characters that taught us. So we had, of course, Professor Stirrat, who I think, you know, was a great friend to us as medical students and always used to turn up at our medical student balls, and we were all extremely fond of you, Gordon. But there were some stars. There's Jim Drive, of course, who lectured us and went on to do great things and become a major contributor to the BMJ. So there they are. Right, now I came across this document mainly because I thought it was quite entertaining. So this is obviously from the 1970s. It's very 1970s, You and Your Baby. But it has got some useful information in it. Obviously you should select your oranges carefully when you're wearing your maternity dress as you pop to reg the veg. Here we are, some advice for father, a help and comfort. Deeply involved in a successful home delivery is the father. A husband with the right kind of temperament, not yet defined, will sustain his wife's morale during the first part of her labour, blah, blah, blah. But not every man feels he's able to do this. Fair enough, that gives you the get out clause. And I was also intrigued in this one, which is, if the flooring is linoleum, that is good. So take up your carpets and pop down your linoleum. Do's and don'ts of pregnancy. Pregnancy is not an illness, all sensible stuff. And possibly something that might not get included in a You and Your Baby magazine these days, which is, do go on looking as nice as you can. So make a special point of keeping yourself well groomed, well washed and sweet smelling. So I did Mrs. Midwinter's firm, and again, we were rather terrified of Mrs. Midwinter, probably without justification. But you know, we had, and I think all credit to the obs and gynae or the obstetric firm. We had very clear direction about what we were expected to do, you know, how we were meant to behave, what we should present. And I thought this is before we get to whole person care, which is now sort of trendy in medical education. Really sensible advice. This is a practical subject. You will learn about life as well as pregnancy from our clients. They're not ill. And this one is very important, I think, for students. We will not be here to talk at you most days. Education has to be the best type, self-education. So self-directed learning, which is something which is very, very important. We were expected to do 10 to 12 deliveries. I can remember there was always a little bit of rivalry between the students and the midwives, who always seemed to get the mothers that were going to give birth within about an hour and a half, whilst we'd spend 12 hours with our potential mum. We did attachments at the General Hospital. Of course, it didn't look as pretty then as it does now. As you may well be aware, it's been turned into luxury flats. But the advantage of being at the General for any of your clinical attachments was the fact that you were right next door to the ostrich. And if you were feeling that you flush with enough cash, you'd pop to the ostrich for a little bit of lunch. My mental health attachment was memorable for this particular patient, I think. So Lynn Bennett was my tutor. Gethin Morgan was the head of the firm. A teenage male of very, very slight build, wearing a duffel coat, jumped off the suspension bridge, was seen jumping off the suspension bridge and didn't die. He did sustain vertebral fractures and then was admitted to the General. And he became a patient that Lynn Bennett suggested I get to know on a very regular basis. And he was a memorable patient, and he had sadly cannabis-induced psychosis, and I think continued to have psychotic problems even well after he left his inpatient stay at the General. End of fourth year, first part finals. So here are some questions for you. We've got here a broad range, I think. It was fairly rigorous, our written finals. So child health, mental health and pathology. This was the exam paper in the morning, 2nd of September, 1983. And then in the afternoon, we had the second paper, surgery, writing short notes, a joint medical surgical question, and obstetrics and gynecology, of course. And then if we passed, we knew we were straight into the 5th year, which was great because that was our written finals over and done with. Final year, notes for our final year. So we had 3 parts. We were supplementary house officer, we had an elective period, and we undertook a community health attachment. I was lucky enough to do my supplementary house job at Frenchay with the lovely and wonderful Roger White, and I was his houseman when I qualified. Community health, again, I've got vague recollections of some of this, and it was prompted a little more by my lecture notes, but I do remember being taught by Sandy Macara and the very benign and charming Ralph Midwinter, who we all knew, of course, was married to Audrey, and that made her feel less scary because he was so nice. And like Liz, I absolutely adored my 2 weeks residential GP attachment, which was down in Wells with a wonderful GP and his family. These were my grades for the end of community health, and these I'd like to think this was in the days before grade inflation, when very good meant very good. C+ was meant to be good, and I think I do know some of my colleagues who did get an E, which I know, no holds barred there, that was abysmal. My year 5 elective, again, Neville Butler was quite influential in the medical school at the time. He had contacts everywhere. And like Liz, I wanted to do paediatrics at the time, I thought. So I wanted to do a paediatric attachment. So I went to Chandigarh. Having only really been to Europe, it was a bit of an eye-opener for me. I went by myself. I had nobody that I was traveling with. And we didn't really think so much about health and safety and risk assessment in those days. But it was an amazing experience, and it certainly started my lifelong affection with India. So I spent my time in Chandigarh, which is a modern city by Indian standards, and it was a truly memorable experience, which will always stay with me. And then we graduated, which was amazing. So this is our degree congregation booklet. You can see now that it's a much more swanky affair. They've obviously got their eye on the alumni donations. If I'm saying cynically, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And here we are. This is me with my mum. This is my closest friend, Alina, and her mum outside the Wills building. This is our year in Royal Fort House. Those that all graduated, of course, people did intercalate, so it wasn't quite the same batch that we started off with, but intercalation wasn't such a big thing as it is now. And what happened to them? So just quickly to let you know, so I counted them up actually, we were 115 graduates in the end, of whom 50 were women. When we had our reunion a few years ago, this was the rough breakdown. Some of these are duplicates, but approximately of the 100 people we could track down, roughly, 50 were general practitioners, 8 in Bristol, 40 were hospital consultants, 6 in Bristol, 10 were professors, 2 have got the CBE. That's John Collinge, who is also an FRS, and Jennifer Dixon, who you may have even seen on the news recently as she's Chief Executive of the Health Foundation. And both of these, I'm pleased to say, have honorary doctorates from Bristol. Some returned to overseas. We had 2 students from Hong Kong in our year. One of our year, so that's Sean O'Kelly, became medical director at UH Bristol until a few years ago. One went into hospital management, and one became a member of parliament, and still is a member of parliament, but I think he is no longer registered with the GMC. So I feel I've always felt I've been incredibly lucky. I owe an enormous amount of thanks to my family, my parents, who always expected me to do as much as my brothers, if not more, to my school teachers, who were amazing. That is right from primary school through secondary school. And I think at university, I think, yes, we were scared, but that, say, as Liz said, you remember those things when you felt slightly you got it wrong and you never did that again. And of course, to a wonderful set of friends. This is us on our post-graduation, pre-starting work trip to Greece. And a particular thanks to these friends who have provided some of the photographs that I've shown you this evening. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Jane, thank you very much. I have to confess, I chuckled about Cro-Magnon man. I thought that was an amazing question to be asked. And I confess also that as a research registrar in 1991 and 2 and 3, we were scared, I won't use the word, but we were quite scared of Mrs. Midwinter, who ruled the gynae theatre in the general with a fist of iron. So whatever other people I want to think, Gordon will remember her well, I'm sure. I may not want to comment on what I've said. Right, so Liz, if you could come back on, if that's possible. So if you unmute yourself and put your camera on, that's great. So the floor is open for questions. I'd like to put a question from Liz to Jane. So Liz was a student in the BRI and said that it was a pretty horrible experience, Jane. You were Academy Medical Dean in the BRI for umpteen years. Remind us how many?
7, I think. Yeah.
7. And you and Jerry Tobin before you.
Yeah.
So So do you echo that experience as a student? I know you like Frenchy a lot, but did you?
I think so I agree at the time. I think we all found French and Southmead slightly friendlier. And I think, Liz is right. We were quite terrified of Alan Reed. I remember, he used to, the boys, if they were slouching and had their hands in their pockets, he would absolutely, tear them to shreds about, how they should appear, how they should present themselves. And I think, at Frenchy, there was there's the postgrad centre and the place where everybody kind of congregated, which BRI has never had that focus, unfortunately, for staff and students. I think, Dolphin House has been the major asset for students, and that was what I think saw me through some of the more challenging times. But yeah, I think it's quite. BRI, because it's dispersed, it's geographically challenged, it's a difficult place. It's a difficult place for a student still.
So is it, yes, so is it better now than it was before?
Oh, I think so. I hope the students don't feel quite so intimidated by the consultant staff as they used to.
Right.
Would that be your feeling, Liz?
Yeah, I think so. I think there isn't the sort of, I think maybe we're not as, I don't know, maybe, I hope, not as unapproachable or apparently unapproachable.
The gynecologists were incredibly approachable in St. Michael's, of course.
Of course.
En masse. Okay, so if anybody else has questions for Liz or for Jane, can you unmute and put your camera on, and let's hear from you and see you. So Victor, hello, welcome.
Hello. I was going to say, you both found doing preclinical separately from clinical more difficult, but now, of course, it's all very well integrated. And to my way of thinking, that makes much more sense. And I wish I'd been able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was hard to see the link between the preclinical and the clinical, because we really did. I don't remember having any exposure to patients in our first 2 years. It just didn't happen in any shape or form.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it just made me so glad that I didn't go to Germany, because I think that it's still like that in Germany.
I mean, we have so many medical students who come to Britain, to Bristol, and it's great to see them, but clearly their experience is very theoretical, and they're hungry for clinical exposure. Thanks, Victor. Gordon, Stirrett, Professor.
One of the things that you both picked up on that I've always really felt was dreadful, even when I was a medical student, was this teaching by humiliation. And as Dean, there was one name that came up I'm not saying which name it was and who it was that said it, but there was one particular name that came up that as Dean, I had very serious discussions about actually stopping him teaching, because he humiliated the students. He didn't stay in Bristol, but I'm not going to say.
I'll go on.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll go on. I'll go on.
But that didn't excuse
no,
those other.
That actually weighed heavily when I was dean, because I was very, very aware of it.
Well, and thankfully we moved a bit on from that approach and things now, I think.
Yes.
Would be my appreciation.
Yes, and I think students are prepared to call out bad behaviour, which is brilliant that they do, actually.
I agree. Good.
Yes, when we actually started the Centre for Ethics in Medicine, one of our students did a survey of vaginal examinations in theatre and consent, and it was published in the Lancet in the end. When most of the women who the students were allowed to do internal examinations on, in fact it was rectal examinations as well on men, that no consent was given. And I think that actually was a bit of a shocking state of affairs, and it began to change things, I'm glad to say.
So can you remember the name of that girl, Gordon? I've heard the paper.
yeah, well, I can't at the moment. I'm sorry, but
Drop me an email.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Peter?
Yeah. This is really a question for both of you, which was, how far do you think, as you went through, certainly by the 5th year, were the students generally able to influence the course or to pass comment on the individuals?
So I have found, amongst my archive of material, I found several feedback questionnaires actually, which I don't remember filling in, and I don't remember whether they had an impact, but I guess there was a willingness to collect feedback from us as students, which is good. I think, I think that the feedback loop and the interaction of students with the medical school is so much better nowadays. When we had things in our curriculum that we couldn't see the sense in them, we just accepted it. When we failed an exam, I don't know about you, Liz, but we just, nobody ever went through with you why you might have failed and what you did wrong, and what you might do to improve. You failed, so you just got to resit it. So I think the support for students and the engagement of students in the curriculum is very much improved in my view. But it wasn't dreadful. It was, there was some attempt to try and gauge feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't collect all that archive material. I obviously, I ditched pretty much everything that I had, because growing up in Hong Kong, we had no space to keep anything. And I've always been somebody who just, when you finish with some material, and I wish I'd had half the material that you had, Jane, because it was wonderful, but I don't remember being asked. And I don't know whether I would have had the courage. Well, apart from with the house job thing, I did think that the system we had was completely ridiculous. And so, I didn't know what was a better system, but I felt I needed to speak to someone, and I felt Malcolm Campbell was certainly approachable enough for me to go and speak to him. But I don't remember filling out anything formal, but then, I don't have the material to prove that.
Okay, thanks.
So Tim Chambers, as a pediatrician who must regret losing two such fine examples of people who could have been pediatricians, do you have a question for them?
No, all the people I thought would make good pediatricians went off and did something far more lucrative and gave them far more free time than we had. But I wasn't going to talk about that. In the early 80s, are there any physiologists here? I don't think so.
I don't believe so.
The Department of Physiology sort of had a rush of blood to the head and decided that they wanted to bring along some patients for the students to see, and I was roped in to do a session on renal function in E29 with the whole year there, and I brought along one of my more histrionic patients who hammed it up wonderfully. She was great, but it all fell apart because they all took renal function and all the tests for tubular reabsorption and glomerular filtration, all that sort of stuff, very seriously. And so they would turn to me and say, well, now, how often did you do the inulin clearance on this child? And I looked rather blank and said, well, we measured her creatinine once or twice. And I could sense that the audience was more on my side than their side, and I fear that after two such sessions, I wasn't invited back. But Jane, if you were in the 80s, I said you might even have been in the audience.
I may well have been, Tim. I'm trying to rack my brains, and I can't remember. I'm afraid.
Very memorable session.
Clearly.
Sorry, I didn't show you her rash.
That would be one of those racy pictures, would it?
I have to declare that that Tim was a great teacher of mine, and I did do pediatric membership. And I remember that when I passed my membership, I had the most wonderful handwritten note from Tim Chambers, which was one of the few things I cherished for many, many years. And I think I still have that note, Tim. It reminded me that whenever I had students or registrars or junior staff who did well, to remember to write to them personally, because it made a huge amount of difference, that sort of recognition. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Will you
Well
send
done,
me a
Tim.
copy to put in my
In your annual appraisal form.
my appraisal file? Because remember that sometime in the distant future, I hope, I may undergo another appraisal. I want your letter to get through the pearly gates.
You will not be found wanting, I think.
You won't.
Okay, let's bring this to an end. I found that really enjoyable. And so yeah, I was muted, so you didn't hear me laughing several times, both Liz and Jane. I thought some of those things, especially those exam papers and the Cro-Magnon man, I thought, you have got to be serious. But I guess there you go. There you go. So thank you both for your contributions, which have been stimulating and very interesting. So this lecture is being recorded. It will be, so Peter Carpenter will process it and do something magical with it, and it'll be uploaded to the website, so you can see yourself again in glorious Technicolor tomorrow if you wish to, if you've nothing else to do. So Liz, you'll probably be at home and you'll have nothing else to do, but Jane will be hard at work at the coalface in the university or in the dermatology clinic.
Yes, yes.
So thank you very much to both of you, and thank you very much for everybody who's attended. Have a good evening, and we will be back in October with our new president, who will be the AGM will be in October, and Jonathan Pitts-Crick, who's the new president, will be giving his inaugural lecture at that time, and we are presently expecting that to be in the Engineers House in Clifton. We're expecting it to be a hybrid, so there will be the physical presence in the room, but also possibly Zoom being available for people as well. And that's all in the future. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, and safe journey down the stairs to everybody, or up the stairs, depending.
And David, thank you very much indeed for this year of your presidency. And it was difficult at the time for doing it in the way you've done, and in the light-hearted but serious, balance. Very difficult.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
But thank you for doing it.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well done, David.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Very good.
Bye.
Bye.